So let's start going up and we'll see how much space there is at the far end and tell you the story up there. How long have you been on the go?
4 days.
Right. So you're halfway through, are you? Your time away?
We're 11.
I'm quite well known in Scotland at home by my friends for always taking an umbrella with me and folding umbrella. And I thought, Israel, late March, no, I left the umbrella behind.
So you could have used it.
It was a mistake. We could have used it. Yeah.
So your last name is
Story.
Storey?
I think maybe we'll stop here because
Okay,
if we go out here, I'll just check.
Under the shade might be nice.
Yeah, no, there are two.
Let's keep under the shade.
If we can stop in here. If we can stop in here, we'll be under the shade actually too. John's Gospel tells us that when Pilate handed Jesus over to the crowd to be crucified, and the soldiers led Jesus out, and Jesus, bearing his own cross, went out to the place which in Aramaic language is called Golgotha, which means skull. The word in Latin is Calvary, which you'll be familiar with as well. Again, just means skull. And there they crucified him. And with Jesus, two robbers, one on either side, and Jesus in the middle. Now, when you come to Jerusalem, looking for places connected with the crucifixion, death, burial of Jesus, and resurrection, there are two places you can come to. There's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is in the Old City, back that way. Have you been there yet?
We were very close to it when we stayed.
Yeah, have you been in it, or?
I don't think any of us have been in it.
I've been in it before.
I don't know if you're going in, but it's very interesting to go into. It's a huge building with all sorts of bits and pieces which have been added at different points of different periods of time, and you sort of go around and sort of think, who on earth has put on that bit there? Who decided that bit? And you can go round and round it, and you can get lost in there. And there you can go down and you can go upstairs as well. It is the place. It has the weight of history with it. From the 3rd century AD, people have believed that is where the events took place around Jesus Christ. In the 1800s, people weren't sure that really was outside the city walls of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, and the book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus was crucified outside the city gates. It also makes sense that people would be capital punishment to take place outside the city walls. You wouldn't want to use your land inside the city, which is valuable. Nobody would want to live in that area. So Jesus was crucified outside the city gates. People weren't sure whether the Church of the Holy Sepulchre really was outside the city walls at the time of Jesus in the 1800s. And that was when interest came in this site. And General Gordon, particularly from England, was here in the 1860s, and he was staying in a house on the city walls there and looking onto this cliff here. And part of the cliff, which we've got a couple of an old photograph which you'll see when you get along there, taken about 1900, and you see this feature in the cliff which looks a bit skull shaped. So maybe this was the place of the skull where Jesus was crucified. So that's why interest came in this. You can make up your own mind whether it was there, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or here. Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a building and it's very much inside. It tends to be very busy too. Whereas here we're in a garden. Of course, Jesus was crucified outside in the open air by the roadside. And so you can visualize the events. And we have a tomb, like the tomb in which Jesus was laid after he had been crucified. Jesus was crucified. Crucifixion takes place beside the city, beside the road. Not on top of a hill, as you might imagine, but the Romans crucified people by the roadside. So as you were travelling along, you would see a crucifixion taken, or somebody on a cross, as a warning to others, to you, that if you don't behave, this is what might happen to you. It was in a busy place, as Jesus is going out, carrying his cross. They meet Simon of Cyrene and they force him to carry the cross of Jesus for part of the journey. The passers-by hurl in insults at them. Here we've got a bus station and you think, oh dear, what a shame. But actually, where Jesus was crucified, ordinary commerce was going on. People were coming and going. It was in the midst of everyday, ordinary life. Cicero is a Roman writer. He tells us that crucifixion was the worst form of capital punishment the Romans had. And you wonder about what other forms of capital punishment there are. Well, John the Baptist was beheaded. Jesus was crucified, and it was reserved for the worst of the worst, for the lowest of the low. And it was so shocking that in polite society, Cicero tells us, in Roman times, you did not mention the word cross. When I read that, it reminded me of Paul's words when he's writing to the early Christians in a place called Philippi, away out west in modern-day Greece today. And he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who emptied himself, took on human form, became a servant, and became obedient unto death. And in our Bibles, whatever translation, whatever language you're reading, there's a comma or a dash at that point. It's thought that up to that point, Paul's been quoting an early Christian hymn, became obedient unto death. And then Paul adds his own comment, even the death of the cross. And he uses that shameful word that you didn't use in polite society. It's meant to shock us. Such was the death that Jesus died when he died, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God. Why did Jesus die? The Bible tells us, Paul tells us in Corinthians, that God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. We had gone our own way in another garden, in the Garden of Eden, which is up northeast from here, in modern day, probably almost certainly modern day Iraq, and decided to do our own thing. And we see the results in our world today in all sorts of ways. We see it in Syria, which you will be, if you're heading north, you'll be going to see. You're going north, yes, you're heading north. Yeah, you'll probably see Syria just across the border there from the Golan Heights. 4 or 5 million people from Syria can't live in their own land anymore. They're now in 1.5 million of them are in Lebanon, and others in the other countries around Syria, because of man's inhumanity to man. What's going on in Ukraine today? But that comes rather closer to that too. Sometimes these things happen, not quite as dramatic as that, but in other ways, in family life. And there are things that each one of us have done, which we're utterly ashamed of, wouldn't want anyone else to know about. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Cold War, the dissident writer from the Cold War era, he described it this, he said that there's a line going down inside every single man, woman and child on earth today. Nothing to do with philosophies, nothing to do with religions, nothing to do with governments. It's a line between good and evil. And we can do wonderfly good things, we can do horribly evil things as well. And we need to be saved from ourselves. Peter, who spent time 3 years with Jesus, put it like this: he himself, Jesus Christ himself, bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. John, who also spent time with Jesus, he put it another way. He said, to everyone who believed in him, he gave the right to be called children of God. And that's something that I know as a daily living relationship, that I am a child of God. And each one of us can know that too. We'll go down to the other end of the garden soon, shortly, to talk about the resurrection and the empty tomb. What we have here is this cliff feature here, and it's those two. What you're looking at, you can see those two sort of indentations in the rock are the part of the skull feature on the rock. If you go along, you can take photographs of the old picture, which was taken about 1900. It shows the skull.
It used to look much more like a skull. You can still sort of see it, but it used to be much more obvious.
As we're also looking at it. Okay, folks.
Several times.
We rode quite a bit, but that's really. We
We're over here in the Arab sort of
So
side
we're
of
really
it.
not that far.
No, I mean this is the old city.
we appreciate your heart for the message you were sharing about the gospel.
Well, we haven't finished.
You know, but that's a good start. It's appreciated.
Well, it's a great joy. It really is. It's just there's just so much, and it's one of the. Yeah, I'm just going to say so much. There's so much detail in the Gospels about what's happened around the events. In the afternoon, it's a Friday afternoon, so you'll know from if you've been here over last Saturday, Saturday, that Shabbat, Sabbath, the Jewish holy day, when nothing happens, starts in the late afternoon of Friday, which I find very confusing. But the trams here stop about 5 o'clock, and if you're away up Mount Herzl, you're stuck. You've got a long way to walk back. So Jesus died 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's not an awful lot of time before Shabbat begins. 6 o'clock, maybe just marginally after. And the Gospel writers tell us that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, they take the body of Jesus down from the cross, they wrap it in strips of cloth, and because the place is near, in a garden, they put Jesus' body in the tomb and then roll a stone across the entrance, and that's all happens that can happen that day. And you can perhaps get a feel for that here. If Jesus was crucified near that cliff, under the cliff there somewhere, on the cross, tomb not far away. There are actually lots of tombs around here behind us, but we have which belong to St. Stephen's Church behind here. We only have access to the one tomb that was found in this garden in the 1800s, 1840 or so, 1840, 1850. It was a farmer, he was looking for a cistern to store water in, and instead he found the tomb that you see, full of rubble at the time, was cleared out subsequently. So you can visualize the events around the crucifixion much more readily in here than you would at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Jesus dies at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What's going to happen to his body? He's been crucified a criminal, worst form, lowest of criminals. Normally, the body of someone who's been on a cross just be left there to be pecked by birds and rot, or thrown into a common grave with other criminals. Matthew tells us that when John the Baptist was beheaded, John's disciples came and took his body away and buried it, gave him a decent burial. Jesus' disciples? Where were they? Well, Judas had betrayed him. In the Garden of Gethsemane, most had fled, deserted him and fled. And that was in the Garden of Gethsemane. If you've been in Gethsemane, you know you're at the bottom of the Mount of Olives, and across the Kidron Valley, you've got the Jerusalem. They're almost certainly not going to flee to Jerusalem because that's where the soldiers are and where the high priest's people are. They're going to flee up the hill, almost certainly to the home of Mary and Martha, up in Bethany, away up the Mount of Olives. Only Peter and John follow to the courtyard of the high priest, and we read about that in the Gospels. Peter then denies Jesus, and when you read the Gospels carefully, it seems only John is at the cross. And we know that because Jesus says to John, "Will you look after my mother, Mary, please?" And so John probably begins to be preoccupied at that stage. The ladies have followed, but they probably don't have any real standing in life, in society. They're certainly not going to be able to go to Pilate and ask for the body of Jesus. There is someone, whether he's there or whether he just hears about it, we don't know, but Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, a member of the Jewish ruling council, who hasn't agreed with their decision. And he goes to Pilate boldly, it says, and he demands the body of Jesus. Pilate is surprised to hear that Jesus has died already. So he sends a centurion from Pilate, from the fortress, which is in the old city, to the cross, which would take another 15 minutes. And the centurion goes to the cross, finds out what the position is, comes back to Pilate, another 15 minutes goes by, and reports that Jesus has indeed died. Pilate gives approval to Joseph to take the body away, the body of Jesus down from the cross. Joseph comes with Nicodemus, who had, from John's Gospel, had met Jesus earlier by night and talked to Jesus. And the two of them take the body of Jesus down from the cross. They wrap it in strips of cloth, linen, and with spices. And because the place is near, in the garden, place the body of Jesus in the tomb. The tomb happens to belong to Joseph of Arimathea. They roll a stone across the entrance. The women have seen where and how the body of Jesus was laid in the tomb. And the stone is rolled across, and they have to go off to their homes because Shabbat, the Sabbath day, is beginning Friday evening. And nothing more can happen. Nothing more can happen that day. They've got to. Joseph and Nicodemus themselves wouldn't be able to participate in the Passover or the feast that was about to happen because they've become unclean. They've handled an unclean body, a dead body, which makes them ritually unclean. And they've obviously counted the cost in terms of not being able to take that particular feast. Nothing more can happen that day. The next day, nothing can happen. It's Shabbat itself. Early on the third day, Mary of Magdala, Mary, the mother of James and Joses, and Salome come to the tomb, bringing spices to anoint the body of Jesus properly for burial. As they come out through the city gate, they ask themselves, who will roll the stone away for us? Because it is very great. They realise it's larger than they're going to be able to move themselves. When they get to the tomb, they find that the stone has already been rolled away. And Matthew's Gospel has a wonderful detail. He tells us that an angel descends from heaven, there's an earthquake, the angel goes to the tomb, rolls the stone back, and sits on it. Now in the Bible, when somebody sits on something or sits down, it's often significant. Jesus, having accomplished salvation, sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. Hebrews chapter 1. The angel this day, the task that he'd been given to do was to roll back the stone across the entrance of the tomb in which the Messiah had been laid. And he rolls it back, sits on it, task done. The women come to the tomb and they meet an angel or angels who ask them, why are you looking for the living amongst the dead? He is not here, he has risen. The cry of the Christian church down through the ages in all places and at all times. He has risen. Mary, however, doesn't understand. She's seen Jesus crucified on a cross, die, buried, placed in a tomb. What does being risen mean? And she's weeping outside the tomb. She becomes aware that there's someone beside her. She thinks he's the gardener. And you can understand this morning why she thought he was the gardener. We're in a garden early in the morning. Who else would be there except a gardener? Sir, if you've taken his body away, tell me where you've put him, and we will go and get him and anoint his body properly for burial. And the gardener just says one word, Mary. And in that one word, Mary's life is transformed. Jesus, who has indeed been crucified, died, buried, placed in the tomb, has returned to life. And that one word changed her life. It changed the lives of the disciples who'd been with Jesus. And they went from this city where we are today, from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to the ends of the earth, even the ends of the earth where you and I come from. We'll go down to the tomb just in a moment. I think we shouldn't be too badly off having to wait for other people ahead of us. Just be careful when you get there because it's a bit uneven. You have to bend down to get in. Somebody cracked their head yesterday, a lady, so just be careful as you go into the tomb because you have to bend down to get in. It is a typical Jewish family tomb from the time of Jesus. We don't claim it is the tomb that Jesus was put in. And part of the reason for saying that is that on the right-hand side of the entrance as you go in, you'll see the stonework on the outside across the front, and that's because the tomb was damaged. The Crusaders were here around 1200 AD, and we know that they damaged the tomb. Now, if they'd thought this really was the tomb of Jesus, they wouldn't have damaged it. When you go in, you've got space immediately in front of you that you walk onto, and that's the weeping chamber where you'd mourn for your loved one and you wrap it the body in cloth or linen with spices, and then on the right hand side, which unfortunately here is behind railing, which rather so spoils it in my view, just to preserve the whole place. But on the right hand side, behind the railing, is where the body would be laid. And in this tomb, there's space for 3 bodies, which originally would be stone slabs, a bit like what you're sitting on. They've long since gone, and so there'd be 1 stone slab on one end, 1 on the other, and 1 at the far side. And you can sort of see that there've been marks where stone has been, but long since gone. On the wall opposite you, there's a marking in paintwork, which is a Byzantine cross. It's a kind of cross that Christians in the Byzantine era, which is after the Roman Empire, roughly the fall of the Roman Empire through to 1453 when Constantinople fell. That was the end of the Byzantine Empire, and during that period Christians used this cross. And around Jerusalem here, we saw some the other day at St. Peter Gallicantu, carved in the rock. This one is just painted on, and what we think it suggests is that this tomb was used by Christians during that period of time for burying their dead. We have a stone, there's a channel for a stone in front of the tomb. It's not, but we don't, and there's a stone opposite, which is only about this high. It comes from another tomb in Israel. The stone that belonged to this tomb, archaeologists reckon it would have been much bigger, long since gone. Over 2,000 years, things disappear or broken up or whatever. So it's not actually the stone that belongs here. So let's go down. That's our stone there.
This little fence is
When I was at home, I called it written after I had been here in 2019. Matthew's Mark's Gospel says when the woman looked in on the right hand side, they saw.
He was saying that all his tours for April were packed. Where he put down sold out. He must do several a year. I don't know.
Yes, I think he's still.
I haven't seen his stuff.
A couple of street lights just I didn't quite understand what it was, but they were saying that people would be short of money, and I think they'll probably talk about Israelis in the next few months, but they're reckoning October, November. Really busy. I wasn't quite sure. I reckon they'd be quieter before then, although you've Easter. We want to go up to, for communion, up to Almond, which is so.
The Harvey Foundation.
Oh, maybe.
So John,
Hey.
is your wife here?
She's This is an old wine press which is found around 1923, 1924. and has only partially been dug out. It's getting the treading floor where you press to tread the grapes out. It's actually up there, hasn't been excavated yet, and the juice would flow down here, and then you'd pick it up with a scoop of some kind and put it in wineskins. And the archaeologists reckon this is 2,000 years old. So this area here would have been a garden in Jesus' time. You were sitting under olives there, but in Jesus' time this would have been a vineyard because of the wine press. Watch your feet as we go down here.